Rolling. We're at about 6:30. People will probably continue to join us. Uh, so thank you for joining the Dowagiac Area History Museum for its first virtual program. My name is Steve Arsenault, the museum director. We have at least one more program scheduled for May, and that's going to be me. And we might get another one for June with the hope that the pandemic eases up and we're able to start in-person programming at our fall lecture series, including having our speaker come to Dowagiac and actually expand on his program tonight sometime in August. Before we get started, I want to let you know how this is going to proceed. First, most of you likely entered the meeting without the audio and video turned on. Please keep it that way. If you do have your video and audio activated, please turn them off so the only video and audio people get is our speaker tonight. Ron will do his program tonight, about 45 minutes, and then we'll do a Q&A with me moderating the session. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat dialog box, which you can find if you move your mouse or your finger over anywhere. The chat box will kind of show up in the bottom. If you click on that chat, a different window will open up and you can type in your question there. I will make notes of the questions and I'll moderate and ask Ron the questions at the end of his program. Please do not hop in and turn your audio on while Ron is speaking. The May program will be me, and I'm going to do a program I've titled A Few of My Favorite Things. Any folks who like The Sound of Music or John Coltrane may recognize the name of that song. It will be a virtual tour of my favorite artifacts in the museum and some of the backstories behind the artifacts, and it's more information than you actually will get from just reading the labels that I've put out throughout the museum. For tonight's program, I'm happy to have Ron Kirkwood doing his program on Gettysburg and Spangler's Farm. Ron is a Dowagiac and Sister Lakes native who authored Too Much for Human Endurance, the George Spangler Farm Hospitals, and the Battles of Gettysburg, which is published in June of 2019, went into its second hardcover printing in October of 2019, and paperback and audio versions of the book are now available as of February of this year. Kirkwood graduated from Dowagiac Union High School in 1973 and Central Michigan University. He retired after a 40-year career as an editor and writer in newspapers and magazines, including USA Today, the Baltimore Sun, the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania Patriot News, and the York, Pennsylvania Daily Record. He edited national magazines for USA Today Sports and was the National Football League editor for US Today Sports Weekly. He won numerous state, regional, and national writing and editing awards during his career and managed the copy desk in Harrisburg when the newspaper won a Pulitzer Prize in 2012. So he has a great pedigree and has done Dowagiac proud. Way to go, Ron. Ron Kirkwood lives in York, Pennsylvania with his wife of 44 years, Barbara. So please, we can't really give a round of applause, but welcome Ron Kirkwood.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much for having me. This is a special presentation for me because I grew up just a few blocks from where the museum sits today. This is my great-grandfather, Thomas, and my great-grandmother, Melissa, on the left. Grandpa Thomas, this photo ran in the Dowagiac Daily News for their 50th wedding anniversary. He fought in Company A of the 19th Michigan in the Civil War. He enlisted in Dowagiac. He lived in Wayne Township. He was injured in Georgia in 1864, but he survived the war and returned to Cass County, where he lived out his life and continued my family's line. More Dowagiac roots. My grandfather, Claire Kirkwood, worked at Round Oak. He was a supervisor there. My mom and dad met at Heddon's, and they were married in Vandalia. And I spent my early years in this house on Dewey Street in Dowagiac until my family moved to Sister Lakes. I graduated from Dowagiac in '73, which was a great year for athletes and sports, not including me, but some of those great athletes were Edgar Wilson in my class, Johnny Singer, Bruce Bucky Fritz, Mark Manley, Roy Stewart, Steve Corbett. Barb, my wife, is from South Haven, and we've lived in York, Pennsylvania, right next door to Gettysburg for the last 37 years. So let's talk about the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863. I argue in my book, Too Much for Human Endurance, that George and Elizabeth Spangler owned the most important farm in the Battle of Gettysburg. So we'll look at that first. Then we'll discuss the two major hospitals on Spangler property, the Spanglers themselves, and the last 3 days of Confederate Brigadier General Lewis Armistead's life, which were spent on the Spanglers' farm. Now you can see in gray on the map at the left, the Spangler Farm in 1863 behind the Union line. The farm is huge. It's 166 acres and it dominates the countryside behind the line. And as you can see, it's close to the center of the line, it's close to the left flank, and it's close to the right flank of the line. This was a farm that could hold massive amounts of infantry and artillery in reserve right behind the line. Then there are the roads. Granite Schoolhouse Lane cuts through Spangler as shown by the orange arrow. Blacksmith Shop Road is marked by the black X's. Both go directly to the battlefield and connect the Baltimore Pike and Tawnytown Road, the two main arteries. With the Spangler Farm, Union commanders had the size, location, and roads needed to hold massive amounts of reserves close by and get those reserves to the line quickly and often just in time. This was a farm that could help win a battle. Now this map shows how the Army of the Potomac used the Spangler's farm. Number 9 on the map shows the main location of the Army of the Potomac Artillery Reserve, which I'll get to in a bit. And number 4 is the site of the 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital on Spangler land. I'll also get to that one in a minute. Any of you who have studied the Battle of Gettysburg know very well the story of 20th Maine, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, and other 5th Corps regiments that famously defended Little Round Top on July 2nd. But what you might not know is that Chamberlain and the rest of the 5th Corps got to Little Round Top so quickly because the men spent the afternoon on and immediately next to the George Spangler Farm, and their location is shown on the right in this map. This is right behind the Round Tops. You have the 11th Corps Hospital at number 10 on the map. You have ambulances associated with it in George Spangler's wheat fields. Now, right across the street again is the 5th Corps. At about 5 o'clock, the 5th Corps got the word, get to the line. So they rushed down Granite Schoolhouse Lane and Blacksmith Shop Road and got to the Round Tops and the area around Tops. Now, they weren't gone long before the 6th Corps moved into the exact same location. And then they got the orders and they rushed down Granite Schoolhouse Lane to the front. Later that night, a division of the 12th Corps left Culp's Hill, which is up kind of by where it says Rock Creek, a little bit left of that and a little farther up. That 12th Corps division rushed down Granite Schoolhouse Lane and it got to the line just in time to help out. George Meade had his main street in the Battle of Gettysburg, and Granite Schoolhouse Lane was the name of that main street. There were other infantry bivouacs, there were other artillery bivouacs. Powers Hill, where you see numbers 2, 11, 3, and 1, most of that hill is owned by George Spangler. General Slocum sets up his 12th Corps headquarters up there on July 1st, and he remains there through the 5th, well after the battle. Signal station is up on Powers Hill, flags waving. And you get General Meade joining in. He's bombed out of the Leicester House on the Tawnytown Road during the pre-Pickett's Charge cannonade, and he retreats to Spangler Farm, top of Powers Hill, to watch the rest of the battle. Battle's over, the Union wins it, Meade returns to the line, but then the evening of July 3rd, he returns to Spangler Farm and he sets up his headquarters down on the Baltimore Pike at the base of Powers Hill on the George Spangler land. This was an important farm. This photo shows one artillery battery. There were 19 artillery reserve light batteries crowding and overflowing Spangler land at 2 p.m. July 2nd. Now, each of the 7 Union infantry corps at Gettysburg had their own artillery batteries, totaling about 200 cannons among the 7 corps. These cannons went where their assigned corps went. Now, the artillery reserve, they added 106 cannons, 2,300 men, 2,300 horses, another whole third of power. plus the artillery reserve cannons based at Spangler, July 2nd and 3rd, did not have to go where an infantry corps went. They were the crucial utility players who could be counted on to perform well and be plugged in anywhere in the line that they were needed. And that's exactly what George Meade and Artillery Chief Henry Hunt did on the last 2 days of the battle. They rushed cannons from Spangler to the line, often with only moments to spare, to prevent a Confederate breakthrough. Now you can see where Spangler is on the map. Artillery reserve cannons left there. They fought along Wheatfield Road. They fought on the Trossel Farm. They fought all along Cemetery Ridge. They fought on the Cadore Farm. They fought on Cemetery Hill, East Cemetery Hill, and the artillery reserve was even on Spangler's own Powers Hill. Other farms saw a lot more combat than the George Spangler Farm at Gettysburg. Some were literally destroyed by this combat, but no single farm played a greater strategic and logistical role with its two roads, with Powers Hill and its in the middle of it all location, and the George Spangler Farm in setting up the Army of the Potomac victory in the biggest battle of the Civil War. Now, let's move on to the hospitals. The 1st Division caught the heaviest of the blow. Many killed and wounded were the result, and the latter were now being brought to the hospital in great numbers. Granite Schoolhouse surgeon in charge, Dr. William Warren Potter, 57th New York. Now, you might remember that I showed you on the map, the Granite Schoolhouse and his hospital was right on Granite Schoolhouse Lane in the middle of George and Elizabeth Spangler's farm. It was built in the early 1860s when the Spanglers donated the land for it. On days 2 and 3 of the battle, there was a major 1st Division, 2nd Corps Army of the Potomac Hospital in the fields and woods around this school. This hospital has received little attention since the battle, and little has been revealed about it until my book came out, and I think that's a shame. It's just overgrown, unmarked land now with thorns and poison ivy that make it difficult to enter, as shown in the bottom left photo. But this hospital hosted the 1st Division, 2nd Corps wounded and dying men who fought at Rosewoods and the Wheatfield, two of the most well-known places on the battlefield. These were the fighters of the famous Fighting Irish Brigade. This was a division of Father William Corby, the future president of Notre Dame, who gave the men general absolution moments before the Day 2 battle, thus clearing their path to heaven. This was the corps of General Winfield Scott Hancock. More than 1,000 men of the 1st Division were casualties on just that one day of fighting. And by the end of July 2nd, most of those wounded were either at the 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital, at the Granite Schoolhouse on the George Spangler Farm, or they were waiting to be taken there. Chaplain John Henry Wilbrand Stuckenberg of Erie and the 145th Pennsylvania served at the Granite Schoolhouse Hospital. He said, "Our hospital was at the foot of Powers Hill. I found the doctors and nurses busily engaged with the wounded, scattered around in all directions, some lying on blankets, some on straw, a few on stretchers, others on the bare ground. Private Erastus Allen of Company G, shot through the abdomen, suffered terribly. Some of the intestines protruded through the wound, and some of their contents would occasionally flow out, producing a horrible stench. It was very evident that our regiment had again suffered severely." 2nd Corps Ambulance Chief Lieutenant Thomas Livermore of New Hampshire made numerous deliveries to Granite Schoolhouse on July 2nd. He said, "Here under the shelter of some boulders lay a large number of our wounded and dead who had been brought from the field. They lay upon the ground covered with their blankets, and the living were nearly all silent, having fallen asleep from fatigue." Brigadier General Samuel K. Zook was treated at Granite Schoolhouse on July 2nd for a massive chest wound before dying in a house farther behind the line on July 3rd. His wound opened such a gaping hole that a doctor could see the general's heart beating. This monument on Wheatfield Road at the top left of the page marks where General Zook was mortally wounded at Gettysburg's famous Wheatfield. Colonel Edward Cross, 5th New Hampshire, died July 2nd at Granite Schoolhouse after being mortally wounded on the opposite side of the wheat field from General Zook. Cross Avenue between Devil's Den and the wheat field bears his name. Colonel Cross was beloved as a great fighter in New Hampshire and by many of his men, but he was despised by others for his drinking and his tantrums. His unit's Pioneer Corps called him a tyrant, and they refused to bury him. The monument at the middle of the page is to Cross and his fighters. Lieutenant George A. Woodruff of the 1st United States Artillery Battery I, mortally wounded on July 3rd during Pickett's charge when he was hit in the back while facing and directing his men at Ziegler's Grove. The son of a judge from Marshall, Michigan, died at Granite Schoolhouse, telling his friends that he regretted being shot in the back and asking that it should be no reflection upon his reputation. Most of the 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital at Granite Schoolhouse was moved to safety farther behind the line on day 3 after 24 hours of intense service because it was getting hit by Confederate artillery overshots from the pre-Pickett's charge cannonade. Now the big hospital. Now the Granite Schoolhouse Hospital that the Spanglers had was a division hospital. There's 3 divisions in a corps. Around their buildings, up by the house, this was a corps hospital, all 3 divisions. This was a major one. One day cured me of a hospital. Give me the picket line every time in place of a hospital. Captain Matthew B. Cheney, 154th New York, after visiting the 11th Corps Hospital. The 11th Corps medical staffers picked the Spangler's Farm for a hospital on July 1st because of its proximity to the evolving front line. It had access to water, had crops, livestock for food, buildings for hospital purposes, good roads, and wood for operating tables, tents, fires, and caskets. While the 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital used the school on Spangler land, the 11th Corps Hospital used the Spangler's barn, summer kitchen, house, other outbuildings, and fields. Excuse me. George Spangler was 47 years old. Excuse me. His wife, Elizabeth Spangler, was 44 during the Battle of Gettysburg. Their children, all of whom were living at home in 1863, were 21-year-old Harriet, 19-year-old Sabina, 17-year-old Daniel, and 14-year-old Benaiah. The 6 Spanglers were ordered by 11th Corps doctors on July 1st to either leave or stay together out of the way in one upstairs bedroom. So that bedroom is where this family lived, all 6 crowded together in summer heat during the 5 weeks and 2 days that their home was occupied for a hospital. They could leave the room, but in doing so, they had to step over and around wounded and dying Union officers just to get out of their house. The farm of the Spangler neighbors, the Lightners, also was used as a hospital, and the Lightners left because the smells in their house made them sick. The ambulance corps started delivering 11th Corps and other wounded to Spangler at about 4 p.m. on July 1st, day 1 of the Battle of Gettysburg. At the hospital's peak attendance on July 4th and 5th, the Christian and Sanitary Commissions estimated that there were about 1,900 wounded men in this hospital, with 50 to 75 Confederates among those 1,900 wounded. Dr. Daniel G. Brinton of Westchester, Pennsylvania, over by Philadelphia. The wounded soon began to pour in, giving us such sufficient occupation that from the 1st of July till the afternoon of the 5th, I was not absent from the hospital more than once, and then but for an hour or 2. Very hard work it was too, and little sleep fell to our share. 4 operating tables were going night and day. Many of them were hurt in the most shocking manner by shells. My experience at Chancellorsville was nothing compared to this. I never wished to see such another sight. For myself, I think I never was more exhausted. Surgeries and amputations took place here under the forebay of the Spangler's barn. There, doctors could have more light and fresh air away from the smells and crowds inside the barn. Surgeons worked here with their backs to the wall of the barn. A surgeon could finish an amputation in 5 to 15 minutes, depending on the limb, and then move immediately to the next one. No washing required, bloody or germ-infested hands or bloody equipment, because they didn't understand how proper sanitation could prevent infection and reduce the spread of disease. A Spangler surgeon approaching total exhaustion called the work too much for human endurance. Private William Southerton, age 19, 75th Ohio, said, "At the doorway, I saw a huge stack of amputated arms and legs, a stack as high as my head, the most horrible thing I ever saw in my life. I wish I had never seen it. I sickened." Amputated limbs were loaded into a wagon or a wheelbarrow and buried somewhere in a distant location on the farm. The amputations and surgeries and wounds attracted an infestation of flies that relentlessly harassed everyone. Pigeons in the barn added to the filth, and hornets added to the pain. Then there were the maggots that covered wounds and stones. Infections were expected after a Civil War surgery, and the worst infections could be smelled 8 to 10 feet away. So imagine the stench that greeted a hospital staffer, visitor in the barn, or when entering a tent filled with 8 to 10 men, all suffering with infections. To help battle these smells, Spangler hospital workers cut branches off pine trees, and they hung them on the tents, and they used them inside for bedding. George and Elizabeth Spangler had a classic Pennsylvania bank barn with that 7-foot 4-bay overhang in the front, and the bank, as you can see in the back, that allowed the farmer to drive his wagon right up to the very top floor for loading and unloading of crops. I think these barns are works of art. I think they're genius. I've only seen them throughout southern Pennsylvania. I've seen them in Maryland and Virginia and maybe into Ohio a bit, but their main concentration is out here in south central Pennsylvania. This design was, excuse me, was brought over by the Germans and the Swiss in the 17 and the 1800s. Men were so crammed so closely together in the Spangler's barn that it caused the spread of diseases. Some men died of these diseases rather than the battle wound that brought them to the hospital. All of this hospital was horrific. All of this barn was horrific, but it was the worst under the forebay where the amputations took place and just inside that front wall in the stable. That's where many of the worst cases awaited their surgery amid cries of agony and smells of infection, body fluids, and human feces. Cries and screams could be heard 50 yards away in the Spangler's house. Hospital workers covered their head with a pillow at night to try to drown out the sounds. Nurses read scripture and prayed with the men in an attempt to help send them on their way. Outside in the Spangler fields, the Army didn't provide enough tents or bedding or food or clothes for the first several days, multiplying the misery of the wounded and dying men who were forced to lie in the mud in the open when the thunderstorms came. Corporal William R. Kiefer, a hospital steward from the 153rd Pennsylvania, which is in the Allentown area, he said, hundreds were lying with but feeble, or in most cases with no shelter, exposed to a cold, incessant rain against the sides of the barn and in an orchard adjoining the sheds. Their moans were heard in every direction, and with a lantern I moved about from one to another during the long hours of night. I searched in vain for blankets to cover the suffering and dying. Private Henry Blakeman of the 17th Connecticut said, "We saw pretty hard times lying on the ground. I was wet through and not half enough to eat. I wore the same shirt that I was wounded in, all bloody, for 9 days, and half that time it was full of maggots, and I wore the same pants." Two female nurses played key roles at Spangler. Marilla Hovey and her 17-year-old son, Frank, traveled with her husband, Dr. Bleecker Lansing Hovey of the 136th New York, and she was always one of the first to reach the hospital during a battle. Unfortunately, no photos of Mrs. Hovey are known to exist today. The Hoveys are the only surgeon's family known to have traveled together during the Civil War. Mrs. Hovey nursed the wounded and wrote home to family members of the dead and dying. She was able to go into sort of an autopilot mode, look past their terrible wounds and suffering, and hold the hands of dying soldiers and talk to them in a desperate attempt to get their mind off their agony and their situation. In one letter from Spangler, Mrs. Hovey informed a family of their son's death and told them, I have had a good deal of care of him and called him my soldier boy and tried to take the place of mother, sister, and friend. I think I never had such a trial parting with one that I had no more acquaintance with. The Hovies worked at the 11th Corps Hospital the entire 5 weeks it was open. Then they went home to New York for 3 weeks to recover from what they had just been through. Nurse Rebecca Lane Pennypacker Price of Phoenixville, also over by Philadelphia, rode to Gettysburg on a bench in a railroad cattle car in the middle of the night with donations shortly after the battle. Then she went to work as an unpaid nurse at Spangler. She said, the sad scenes would fill a volume. So many times at night, I lay on my stretcher, weeping instead of sleeping. Captain Augustus Vinyos of the 107th Ohio was wounded on July 1st on what is now known as Barlow Knoll. Gangrene developed and his right arm was amputated above the elbow at Spangler. Mrs. Price nursed him from near death until he was well enough to take a train home to Canton, Ohio. He went on to marry in 1866, have 9 children and many grandchildren, while amassing substantial wealth as a businessman. He was a pallbearer at the funeral of close friend, President William McKinley. Vinyos actually carried Mrs. Price's photo for 40 years after the war. He often showed her photo to fellow ex-soldiers at national encampments in an attempt to find her and thank her, but always without luck. Finally, in 1906, he received a letter. Dear sir, do you remember the tall nurse at Gettysburg who furnished you with clothing so that you could go home? She had found him. Vinyos replied that he looked forward to seeing her with great pleasure, and their reunion took place at a GAR encampment in New York State in 1906, 43 years after they met at the Spangler's farm. This is my wife, Barb. She and I spent a week researching up at Cornell University in the Finger Lakes region of Ithaca, New York. We were there looking for information on the 154th New York because they had surgeons and patients at the Spangler Hospital. And we went through 19 of these big boxes that were just filthy. And we left each day covered in 1800s and early 1900s dust and dirt and papers. But it was worth, in fact, I should add that it was so filthy that by the time we were done, after we were done, Cornell University shut down this area. And you can only get to this research work now wearing a hazmat suit. But it was worth it because these guys of the 154th New York were there at the farm when Confederate General Lewis Armistead arrived, and they talked about it and they wrote about it. And because of that, that was a complete surprise to me. I wasn't expecting it, but I got so much new information that it hasn't been printed anywhere on Armistead for a chapter on him. So I was grateful for the dust and the opportunity and the week up at Cornell. Armistead began the final walk of his life in what would become known as Pickett's Charge on the Seminary Ridge farm of Henry Spangler. He would die 2 days later on the farm of Henry's half-brother, George Spangler. Armistead arrived at George and Elizabeth Spangler's farm at dusk on July 3rd, 1863, according to Dr. Henry Van Arnhem of the 154th New York. Armistead arrived in an ambulance. He was removed on a stretcher and placed on the ground next to the ambulance and near the Spangler's barn. 11th Corps Hospital workers Private Emery Sweetland and Private Edson Ames of that 154th New York described Armistead's appearance as pretty bloody and covered with blood. Sweetland heard Armistead as he lay on a stretcher say, "You have a man here that is not afraid to die." The Spangler's property at this point was a shoulder-to-shoulder mass of chaos, agony, and crying when Armistead arrived. Many wounded from Pickett's Charge were pouring in as overwhelmed surgeons desperately tried to find who could be saved with immediate attention. Even so, the arrival of the Confederate general turned heads, and a large crowd of workers and gawkers formed around his stretcher, circling Armistead. The crowd was eventually broken up when Dr. Van Arnhem arrived at Armistead's side and ordered that he be carried away for treatment. Fellow Spangler patient, First Lieutenant T.C. Holland, 28th Virginia, said he and Armistead were placed in the orchard. Lieutenant Holland said at one point under the trees that Armistead asked the doctors and nurses working around him to, "Please don't step so close to me." Dr. Van Arnhem described Armistead as wild, nervous, flighty, saying, "War must cease, men of the same blood," and he could not live. Spangler patient Private Justice Silliman, 17th Connecticut, described the 46-year-old Armistead as rather past middle-aged. Private Sweetland said Armistead had gray hair and whiskers. Dr. J. Kling of the 55th Ohio said Armistead was suffering intense pain induced by the wound. Stimulants and painkillers were immediately given him. Dr. Britton took time to get to know Armistead, calling him a fine man, intelligent and refined. I had considerable conversation with him and was much pleased with his manners and language. Armistead died on July 5th in the summer kitchen. That's that separate building shown to the right of the Spangler's house in this photo. Army of the Potomac Captain Frederick Stowe, the son of anti-slavery author Harriet Beecher Stowe of Uncle Tom's Cabin fame, was Armistead's roommate in that summer kitchen right there, which was reserved for VIPs. Stowe lived. Armistead was wrapped in a blanket, placed in a coffin made of wood from the Spangler's farm, and buried in their orchard. 1 month later, he was exhumed by an embalmer from Philadelphia who was seeking to make money off his body. So Armistead was dug up after a month in a wood coffin. His body was embalmed in whatever condition it was in, and then reburied. His body was dug up one more time in October when relatives claimed it and reburied him in downtown Baltimore. Now for my book, I have found, confirmed, and listed the names, wound, and treatment of 1,436 Union and Confederate men at the Spangler 11th Corps Hospital, and the names of almost 140 men who were buried in the Spangler's peach and apple orchards. The Union men were exhumed within a few months after the battle and reburied in Soldiers National Cemetery in Gettysburg, where Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. Most Confederates, other than Armistead, lay in Gettysburg until 1872, when they were exhumed and reburied across the South. Armistead is one of only 5 Confederates that we know of who were buried at Spangler. 50-year-old Colonel Eliakim Sherrill, 126th New York, died in the Spangler's house. His funeral in Geneva drew lines of people that stretched several blocks. His image is on the monument to the 126th New York in Ziegler's Grove. Assistant Surgeon William S. Moore, 61st Ohio, died at Spangler. Amazingly, he was the only Army of the Potomac surgeon or assistant surgeon to die at Gettysburg. He left behind 1-year-old and 2-year-old children, and young widow Sarah, who was so torn by grief that she mourned for the rest of her life and never remarried. Colonel Francis Mahler of the 75th Pennsylvania also died in the Spangler's house. The Philadelphia City Council honored him with a resolution, and they paid for his funeral. His brother, Second Lieutenant Lewis Mahler, died on the battlefield on July 1st at about the time and place of his brother's mortal wounding. Sergeant Nelson W. Jones, 3rd Maine, died at Spangler after being hit in both legs in the peach orchard by an artillery shell. He died even though he made and applied tourniquets to his legs on the battlefield. He was 20 or 21 years old. Private George Nixon of the 73rd Ohio died at Spangler. He would be the great-grandfather of President Richard M. Nixon. George Nixon was 40 years old when he entered the Army as a poor man working on a rented farm. He left behind a wife and 9 children when he went off to war, very likely only enlisting to make money to support his family. Adjutant and First Lieutenant Joseph Heaney, age 21, 157th New York, died of a leg wound at Spangler. Nurse Price walked next to his stretcher and held an umbrella over him to protect him from the July sun as he was taken to the Spangler barn for an amputation. First Lieutenant Thomas Wheeler, 75th Ohio, age 25, spent almost a month at Spangler before he died of 4 wounds. His parents were at his side, and Nurse Price sang Rock of Ages to him as he died. Many soldiers didn't always tell the whole story of the seriousness of their wounds in their letters home from Spangler because they didn't want their family to worry. Sergeant Henry Seas of the 82nd Ohio wrote, "My leg was amputated just above the knee. I stood the operation very well, being under the influence of chloroform. I am very well cared for and in a fair way to get along well. I hope mother will not worry herself about me." Sergeant Seas died a week after he wrote that letter home to his brother. Many died at the 11th Corps Hospital who were the lone source of income for their sickly parents back home. Many died at Spangler as teenagers. 19-year-old drummer Thaddeus Reynolds of the 154th New York was in such agony from lockjaw as he neared death that doctors put him under with chloroform so he could die in peace. Corporal Andrew Mayberry of the 20th Maine died at Spangler, leaving behind wife Hannah and 5 children aged 6 months to 11 years. One father arrived at Spangler one day after his son died. One wife arrived a few days after her husband's death. Of course, they found out about their loved one's death when they arrived in Gettysburg. The vast majority of 11th Corps Hospital patients survived, though. They included Captain Alfred E. Lee of the 82nd Ohio. He went home from Spangler with a hip wound, and he found his obituary in the newspaper when he arrived at home. Then he walked in on his funeral. Brigadier General Francis Barlow spent a week at Spangler with 3 wounds that numerous doctors declared to be mortal, but he surprised all of them and lived. It is thought that his wife Arabella attended him at Spangler. Corporal James Brownlee of the 134th New York survived 7 gunshot wounds at the Brickyard on July 1st, one of which broke 4 ribs. Almost unbelievably, he was shot 3 times through the bowels and survived. Private Justice Silliman of the 17th Connecticut was knocked out by a shot to the head on July 1st. He was taken to 3 different Confederate hospitals in Gettysburg before arriving at Spangler on July 4th. He healed and became a nurse at both Spangler and Camp Letterman. He said of the scene at Spangler, "The barn more resembled a butcher shop than any other institution. One citizen ongoing near it fainted away and had to be carried off." If you combine the number of wounded at Granite Schoolhouse with the number of wounded at the 11th Corps Hospital, then the Spanglers hosted almost 3,000 wounded soldiers on their property, more than the entire population of Gettysburg of 2,400 at the time. The surgeons at Spangler, I think, were among the best of the best for their time, and they saved far more lives than they lost. And just like the soldiers, these surgeons were taken prisoner, they were wounded, they got sick, and they suffered. Many Spangler surgeons died in their 30s and 40s because of their exposure to disease, their horrifying work, poor food, long marches, and unsanitary camp life. I dug up in my book research the names of 15 head surgeons who worked at the 11th Corps Hospital, and most of them went on to leadership roles in medicine and their community after the war. These are 3 of my many favorites on the screen. Spangler surgeon Dr. Henry Van Arnhem of the 154th New York was a passionate opponent of slavery who wanted full civil rights for Blacks. He said, "The curse of God visits on all that come in contact with this atrocious institution." Dr. Van Arnhem served 4 terms as a United States Congressman. Unknown to Dr. Van Arnhem, however, his nephew and namesake, 22-year-old Captain Henry Van Arnhem Fuller of the 64th New York, was killed July 2nd in Rosewoods at Gettysburg, while Dr. Van Arnhem worked nearby at Spangler. There's a marker there at the site of his nephew's mortal wounding. Dr. Van Arnhem constantly told his wife in letters home, how much he missed her. Spangler surgeon Dr. Henry K. Neff of the 153rd Pennsylvania was captured at Chancellorsville, and he was held prisoner for 4 weeks, and his health never recovered. He was sick with pneumonia as he cared for others at Spangler, and he remained sick after he was transferred to work at Camp Letterman later in July. He died not long after the war at age 45. Spangler surgeon Dr. J. Kling of the 55th Ohio was captured by Confederate cavalry while on his way home and imprisoned for 3 months after being mustered out in Georgia in 1864. He filed a claim to the government for losses sustained and expenses incurred, but was denied because he was taken prisoner after he was mustered out. The 11th Corps wounded continued to be sent away until the Spanglers finally got their farm back on August 7th, at least what was left of it. George filed 3 damage claims to the state and federal governments totaling about $5,000, but the Spanglers received only $90. And it's believed that the entire $90 went to their Washington, D.C. attorney, so they got nothing. The U.S. quartermaster's agent said in denying, the government of the United States is no more responsible for bringing on the battle fought there than it would have been had a tornado passed over the country, causing as widespread destruction as did that terrible engagement. That battle and hospital damage was his misfortune. The photo at the top left is one of only 3 known photos of members of George Spangler's immediate family. And this one shows their youngest son, Benaiah, his wife, Sarah, and daughter, Mary Elizabeth. And this photo was probably taken in 1888 for the 25th anniversary of the battle. Benaiah and his family were living on and running the farm at this point after his parents purchased a smaller farm next door and moved there. This photo shows how well the Spanglers rebuilt even without government help, how well they built their farm after the battle, even adding everything. As you look at the house and you see the porch, everything to the left of that porch, they added on after the battle as part of their rebuilding. Obviously, there's no refrigeration or electricity in the 1860s. So the Spanglers had a smokehouse. You can see that white building that covers some of the left side of the house where they smoked their meats, salted and smoked their meats to preserve them. You can see their little outhouse outside the picket fence. To the right of the house is the summer kitchen that I mentioned earlier. The Spanglers did not have a kitchen in their house. Back then they liked to do all of their cooking out of the house, not cause fires and because of the heat. And these Pennsylvania bank barns and farms from the Germans, they always had buildings, sheds, chicken coops in between the house and barn as shown there. I was really thrilled recently to find this photo at the top right of Daniel and Effie Spangler. This is the Spanglers' number 3 child. This photo was taken on their wedding day in 1892. So now I have photos of Spangler's sons, Daniel and Benaiah, but I'm still looking for their sisters and their parents. The photo at the bottom right is the other known photo. This photo is from 1886 or 1887 and is in front of Granite Schoolhouse and includes 4 members of George's family. This is where Mary Elizabeth attended school on her grandfather's farm, just a 1/4 mile walk from the house. Benaiah is at the far left, marked by the orange X, looking like he just walked off the set of the movie Fiddler on the Roof. Benaiah is in the photo because he was on the township school board. His dad was a former president of the school board, as was his grandfather. Benaiah's daughter, Mary Elizabeth, is marked by the star. Clara Patterson is under the arrow and Alice Patterson is under the oval. They are the daughters of George and Elizabeth Spangler's second child, Sabina Patterson. Teacher Maggie Schwartz is on the right, looking like she's holding a ruler. The little boy in front with his dog is Raphael Sherfy. The Sherfys owned the peach orchard, the famous peach orchard where a lot of important July 2nd fighting happened. Raphael's father had already died by the time this photo was taken, but despite that, he grew up and became a prominent dentist in the area, and he did well for himself, little Raphael. George Spangler was chairman of the Cumberland Township School Board, like I said, when he donated the land for Granite Schoolhouse to be built in 1861. He also was a church and Adams County leader, serving on several boards, including the Evergreen Cemetery board that voted not to allow Confederate burials there. A teacher whom George hired said Mr. Spangler proved himself to be a very efficient school official and made a lasting impression on my mind as a man of truthfulness and honesty in all things. Elizabeth Spangler took care of her widower father in his later years, and she made sure he was buried next to her and George. The Spanglers also took in a niece after George's sister Susanna died. All 4 Spangler children became productive adults. Harriet and Sabina married local farmers, worked hard, and had families. Daniel moved to Kansas to use his carpentry skills in the growing new state and settled near Abilene around the time Wild Bill Hickok was marshal there in the early 1870s. Benaiah worked the family farm for many years until he gave up farming and moved into Gettysburg in about 1890. As was common in families in those days, personal tragedy followed the Spanglers. George's daughter Harriet died 2 months after he died. Then Harriet's daughter Annie died a few days after her mother. So Elizabeth lost her husband, a daughter, and a granddaughter in a little more than 2 months. One of Daniel's 2 sons drowned in Kansas, and Benaiah's only grandchild died as a toddler. After an almost complete rebuild since purchasing the property in 2008, the Gettysburg Foundation now opens the farm to visitors and offers programs and tours on weekends in June, July, and August, including this year during the virus. It's on a regular schedule, so you can look it up on the foundation's website. Come visit. One of my Dwajak classmates, a 73 Vic Deming, has been to Spangler, and I'm betting that he comes back. It's important to note that most of the wood in that rebuilt barn was there in 1863 and is the same wood that the men lay on and next to. Some of that barn's wood even dates to a log cabin barn that was built on the property in the 1700s. The Spanglers recycled that 1700s wood when building this barn. I'd like to close with 2 thoughts from Spangler 11th Corps Hospital worker Private James R. Middlebrook of the 17th Connecticut. He wrote to his wife Frances from Spangler and said, "It is enough to make one's heart bleed to witness the amputations. I feel it my duty to do all I can for them. I cannot see them suffer and shall stay as long as I can stand it." Private Middlebrook survived until the end of the Civil War. And after nearly 3 years of service and all those battles and all that suffering and all that movement all over the East Coast, it was the fight at Gettysburg and his work in the Spangler Hospital that Middlebrook remembered most in one of his last letters home before being mustered out. "Make up your mind to travel some when we get home," he wrote in July 1865. "I think of going to that place long to be remembered, Gettysburg." Folks, thank you so much for allowing me to speak for my hometown museum tonight. It's been a real honor.
All right, do any people have questions? If you do, type them into the chat box and we'll be happy to ask Ron questions. Ron, I've got one. You talked about coming back in August. What would part 2 be examining that wasn't covered tonight?
I have one talk entirely about the women who served at the farm. So, I touched on the women tonight, and it's called "Women Come to the Rescue" at the George Spangler Farm. That talk is all about women. I have another one just entirely about Granite Schoolhouse. So I think the women
choice,
talk.
huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll have maybe I'll get some feedback from the other people who joined us tonight.
I'll send you a brief summary of the event. I actually have 3 or 4 talks. I'll send you brief summaries on all of them, and you can choose what sounds interesting.
Okay.
Steve, I did put a question in the chat thing, but I don't know if anybody got it or not.
Let's see. I haven't seen it. What is your question, Barb?
Well, it had to do with, could you tell us more about how you learned about these 19 boxes that had never been looked at that you found at Cornell University, and what that was like.
I just stumbled upon that. I don't even remember actually. I mean, no, I don't remember where I got it, but it might have been a footnote in somebody's book about something completely different, nothing really related to hospitals or anything or the Spanglers. And I saw it and I said, well, I need to explore that because the 154th had a lot of guys at Spangler. And so we went up there, and like I said, however I got it, like I said, I think it was a book footnote in a different book. It was one of the biggest things that I came across in 3 years of research and writing the book.
So did you just go exploring, or you wrote them first so they knew you
Well,
were coming? Or?
They had, their boxes were not organized well. They had 40 boxes from this one lawyer, Edwin Northrup, who was going to write a book about the 154th. But these 40 boxes included, he was a lawyer, and he kept track of everything. And Cornell didn't know which of the 40 boxes had materials on Gettysburg. So Barb and I went up there and we looked around and we thought these 19 boxes are most likely. So we didn't even go through all 40. We just went through the 19 most likely to have stuff on these guys. And 4, 5, 6 of them did. So afterwards, I actually gave my list to Cornell University and said, these are your boxes that has 154th New York in them for future reference. And as it turns out, they closed it. They closed it down because it wasn't healthy.
That is an amazing story right there.
Yeah. It sure worked out, and it was worth all the work. I'm so grateful for what those guys wrote and said, and that I was the last one into it.
Any researchers, we always run into stuff, right, Ron? I remember
Yeah.
one of my early museum jobs was in Waukesha, Wisconsin, and we were taking care of collections, their Native American collection, and it had a lot of stuff from the plains. And I was coming home with bad headaches every day, and found out that the stuff was treated with cyanide, or arsenic, not cyanide, arsenic. And that arsenic was just, I was breathing it in all the time.
Yeah, and that can have long-term effects. It actually did impact my health. A couple months later, I was feeling it in my lungs, and it's still, as you heard from my coughing tonight, that's still with me. And I kind of attribute that to Cornell, but I'm still grateful that we went and we did that, because we got so much new Armistead information. And it's like what you were saying too. I would start in the morning with a plan to research one thing, but then you start down a road, and then you hit all these other roads, and all these other things come up. And by the end of the night, I haven't even worked on the thing I was supposed to work on at the start of the day. You just follow the leads in the paths and see where they go. And one of them took me to Cornell University, thankfully.
Yeah. Any other questions for Ron? If you're having trouble getting into the chat, feel free to unmute and chime in right now.
Ron, this is Howard Poole. Share with us the percentage of survival of the various operations that the surgeons performed.
Hi, Howard. I don't have the exacts with me. I should have. If you got a finger, a hand, toes, a foot cut off, your chances of survival were better than 80 or 90%. You had a better than 50% chance of survival for almost everything. But if you had an amputation of the thigh, up by the shoulder, something big like that, then your chances of survival were only like 10 to 20%. It was pretty low. So the smaller body part, the better, but they had to be careful. Oh, that's another thing. I have a talk just on medicine too. With chloroform, 95% of the men were under with chloroform, but they had to be careful. They had to figure out how much to give them, because sometimes they gave them too much and they died of chloroform. One guy had his finger amputated and died during the operation because he was overdosed with chloroform. So they had a lot to get right.
Any other questions?
This is Janet Ross. I just have a comment. Ron, I'm wondering, have you ever visited the
Where?
museum? Have you ever visited the Museum of Military Medical History along the expressway, someplace in Maryland? Have you ever been there?
There's a museum that I counted on for this book called the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick,
Okay.
Maryland.
Yes.
That's a wonderful museum. And like I said, I spent a lot of time there. And they have a satellite Pry House museum, medical museum over at the Antietam battlefield. When I was just starting out on my research for the book and deciding whether I was going to do it, that museum for Civil War medicine was the first place I went. And I can highly recommend it. And they helped me throughout my research.
Okay.
And I've actually now presented 2 talks down there for them, which I'm grateful for.
Well, I've been to that museum. It was over 10 years ago, but it was really, really good. And the
Yes.
one, 2 points that I remember. First of all, was the fact that so many advances in our modern medicine are initiated through military. So ambulances and so forth.
Right. And a lot of that happened right about the time of this hospital because Dr. Letterman took over as medical director, and the Army's, I mean, the Confederates were using grocery wagons with no springs or anything on them. And guys were bouncing like crazy all over the place. And Letterman came in and he created ambulances with springs, with food, with water, with medicine. The guys were comfortable. They weren't being further injured on these ambulances. And then the first time, I mean, triage is still used today. Is the guy mortal? Is he going to die? Is he going to be fine? Or does he need an operation or surgery to survive? I mean, that first time triage was used was 1862, 1863 in the United States.
Right.
So, yeah, a lot.
I think often we don't think about the role that military medical history plays in our everyday medicine. It's a big one.
There were, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, the other comment I remember reading, I think it was a quotation. And so if this battle happened in the first part of July, it was extremely hot. And you alluded to the smell, but there was a comment or a quotation by someone that said the smell and the flies just lingered. And the people of Gettysburg, it was just intolerable for days after.
It was I'm sorry, go ahead.
The people who were lying on the battleground, who were not dead, and that were loaded into these wagons that you talked about, many of them just pleaded, just let me die, because if you can imagine being so severely wounded and in pain, and then on a bouncy wagon, they wanted to just die instead of, it just exacerbated their discomfort.
You're right. And a lot of these guys arrived in the ambulance at Spangler and they were screaming. Because they were in such pain. Many of them had passed out. And the other bad thing for these guys, many of them were wounded on July 1st, but the Confederates took control of Gettysburg right away. And so these wounded guys were trapped behind Confederate lines. And when the Confederates retreated on July 1st, then it was safe for the ambulances to go out and get these guys. So July 4th and 5th was the biggest population of the hospital there because they went out and they picked everybody up.
Right.
And the citizens, you talked about the smell. I mean, the horses, the dead horses were the worst. I mean, the citizens walked around Gettysburg in masks. Now, eventually, there were so many dead bodies around the battlefield that as these folks are cleaning out their homes, because a lot of the homes are hospitals, they just kind of started to get used to the dead bodies and they just went about their business.
Right.
Well,
that part about the dead horses, I remember that because, the human beings were dealt with, but the horses, I mean, there were, I can't imagine how many, but
thousands.
must have been horrible.
Well, they're burning the horses,
Okay.
So
Well,
imagine
I
that.
would really recommend that museum. It was wonderful.
Yes, me too.
Mhm.
The National Civil War Museum of Medicine, something like that.
Yes, something like that. Yep.
Frederick,
Good.
Maryland.
Yep.
Very good.
Mm-hmm.
All right, any other questions? If not, going once, going twice, sold. So let's thank Ron for thank you very much, Ron, for joining us doing this program tonight. And I'll figure out from our membership what program we want to have you come out for. You send me some details and we'll figure out what we want for August. Thank you very
Sounds good.
much, Ron. And in about a month, May 5th, you can join us again with my program on my favorite things at the museum. So thanks a
Thank you,
lot, Ron.
Steve. Thank you.